we left off, I believe, in Ecclesiastes 2 or 3, and I plan on going through surveying the book and finishing it up today. But what I drew up here is just kind of something that I've been thinking through that basically I've seen in studying Ecclesiastes over the last couple weeks is really a set of themes that come up in the book, right? And I was studying and I read through again Ecclesiastes about a month ago, and then obviously for reteaching this material with you guys in class. And what I started to realize, one was that Ecclesiastes and Job have a lot of overlap in them. The MacArthur Study Bible points out Ecclesiastes and Genesis, which does talk about God as the creator and creation and this and that. But it also noticed a lot of overlap with Job. And so that'll be interesting for studying Job later. But the thing I started to realize is that Ecclesiastes is a book that's a little bit hard to outline what each chapter is about, the musings that happen in there. But what you do see repeated are these themes. You see the need for the fear of God. You see the reality of death, right? That we all in human experience, because of sin in this world, we face death. And whether we think about it consciously or not all the time, that reality is always there. Okay, that death, it's not something that we've experienced yet. You only live one time and then you die, right? So, and then Ecclesiastes 3 talks about, along with death, eternity. That God has placed eternity in man's heart. Okay, so that is important, that God has built us into this world where we make decisions in time. And we can't make decisions apart from time. We can't even think in our minds apart from time. But time takes place within the longer timeline of eternity. And so that also ties into what's mentioned in the book from beginning to end several times is God's judgment. God may not judge sin immediately. We may not see him judge sin immediately. There may not be consequences immediately. But God judges everything. And that it says at the end of the book that he brings every matter which is hidden to judgment. He holds everybody accountable in the end. Right? So these things are repeated over and over and over in the book. So that while over here, life seems futile, pointless, purposeless, enigmatic, right? We don't get it. Confusing. All that is true, even if you're a believer. That a lot of times there are things in life where we're just like, I just don't get it. Like, this just doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't seem to be like the world should work this way. God doesn't like this. I know because he says so. But this happens in the world. Right? So life is like this. And if you take this and out of the picture, fear of God, reality of death, eternity, and God's judgment, and you just live over here, in just looking at life as itself, you're like, this place is crazy. This world is futile. It's pointless. I work, I live, I die. Whether I work and have a lot, I can't take it with me. I leave it to other people. I lose control over it. I don't know my time. I'm going to be forgotten. The things I do may not last and probably won't be remembered. I come into this world naked. I leave this world naked. Right? He talks about that in Ecclesiastes, which is a quote from Job. The evil happens in the world that God hates, and it doesn't seem to be punished. Right? So he says, and then I live for pleasure, but no matter how much fun and enjoyment I have, I get to the point where I say, this is foolish. What is the purpose of all this? Right? And so life is very disorienting that way. Right? And if you look at life just for itself under the sun, it is all vanity, it is all striving after the wind. You can never get at what it's really all about. Right? So, but with the knowledge of God, with the fear of God, the reality of death, eternity and God's judgment, because we know that's what's coming in the future, that knowledge orients our life. That knowledge grounds us, brings us back to, okay, here's what really matters, here's what's really important. There are things, that are bothering us today that when we look at them in the light of this, I'm not saying they're unimportant, but that they get kind of put back in place. There are things that are bothering you today that in 24 hours won't be bothering you. There are things that maybe they still will be, but still the fact is the fear of God, the reality of death, eternity, and God's judgment, focusing on the knowledge that that is the reality for every person in the future, says, okay, now how am I supposed to live? Yes?
Can I grab my Bible?
Yes. So, we go on here in Ecclesiastes. Did we talk about time in Ecclesiastes 3? No? Okay. That's fine. So let's talk about time. Ecclesiastes 3 has in it a little poem that is made into a song, and not by a Christian band, but it's there's a time for everything else. You may have heard the song, a time to live, a time to die, a time for this, a time for that. There's a song that goes along with that. But basically, the whole point of this is in Ecclesiastes 3:1, there's an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for everything under heaven. Meaning God is in control. He's outside of time. He's in control and orients all time, and it's all in His hand. But we don't know when the appointed time for every single detail of all of life is. Right? But God is in charge of those things. And God can make our time either worthwhile, or God can also make our time and hard work worth nothing. Right? Mean nothing in the end. Right? You and I have been working on things at certain times where you're like, and then you get to it and you're like, oh, wait a second, I didn't have to do all that. Right? My favorite thing doesn't happen too much around here, but what I started realizing sometimes at work is that sometimes somebody would email you, oh, we're going to do this, there's going to be this big change, this big policy, this thing, and I used to respond, and you guys need to do this, and this, and I used to respond to those things immediately and get right, and be like, okay, well, get all stressed out about worrying about how these changes, and then before I knew it, it would change. Right? So before the policy even happened, people would talk about it and it would change. And so I'm like, well, I'm just not going to, worry about it in the same way that I did before. But listen to Ecclesiastes 3:11. It says, He has made everything appropriate in its time. He also has set eternity in their hearts so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning to the end. Okay? So eternity is in man's heart, but what that means is we only exist in time. We've experienced the past. None of us have experienced the future. We're only here kind of right now, but you and I are not experiencing what's going on all over the world in every place. We're not omnipresent. We're not omniscient. And therefore, while we do have eternity written on our hearts, it says that God is, since He's the only one who knows everything, He's the only one who is present everywhere, that we don't know exactly what God's doing with all the time. Right? So we don't know exactly how God is using everything and how He's timing everything. This is why I think it's a silly argument for people to be like, I won't believe anything unless I see it. Do you realize you and I have not seen and observed most things? Right? Even in science, when you do a scientific study and the scientific method is based on observation, you've heard about this in your science classes, and that's all good. But even if you read a study where other scientists made observations in a lab, you and I were not there to see it. You and I are not seeing and experiencing and knowing everything that's happening all over the world. So when people say, well, I wouldn't know it unless I see it, it's like, well, then you're going to know very little, because you and I experience very little of what's going on around us. Basically, this is one of those evidences that people already know God, is because to know anything at all, you have to know the one who is everywhere, who does see everything, who does know everything. Otherwise, you couldn't make any sense of human existence. So that's why it's a silly argument when people, I won't believe it unless I see it. Or I only believe in empirical evidence. It's like, well, you don't have as much empirical evidence as you think you do. Right? So, anyway, he goes on and continues to talk about time. But he talks about that basically, okay, how do we live knowing that God is in charge of time and that we don't know exactly how he's going to use our time, what he's going to appoint during our lifetimes, how he's going to work in us and use these things. Look at 3:12. He says, I know there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and do good in one's lifetime. Meaning you're supposed to enjoy life and you're supposed to do good while you live. You know, a lot of people are, I want to do this in the future. You know, this and that, the other. It's like, well, then they end up not doing anything. You can't do anything outside of your lifetime. Okay, so he says this is what you should do. You should enjoy life. You should enjoy the times that God gives you. A lot of times people want to be somewhere else. They're young, they want to be grown up. When they're grown, they want to be young. Right? So it's you're supposed to enjoy every time and every stage of life, knowing that it's not always going to be like that. Listen to 3:13. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor, it is a gift from God. That when you know God, then your labor, even if it's not going to last, it's relevant for you right now. And so you can enjoy it. That's God's gift. But only what God does and makes last is what lasts. Listen to 3:14. I know that everything God does will remain forever. There is nothing to add to it, and there is nothing to take from it, for God has so worked that men should fear him. Okay, so only what God does lasts, right? So it's kind of foolish for us to think, well, I'm going to make something last. Well, we're only going to make something last relative to serving God, and if God decides to make it last, right? So what God does, and he says, now here again, he has worked in this way so that we would fear him. God can take everything that we do and make it meaningless. God can also take what we do that we don't think is important at all and make it last in a way that we don't even expect. Okay? Paul wrote a handful of letters while he was under house arrest that changed the world. Okay? So there are people and actions that people don't think are significant. There was a missionary who went, I don't remember which missionary it was. He went and he preached his whole lifetime and no one got saved while he was there. The next generation, lots of people got saved. His whole life, he saw no fruit in what he was doing. Yeah.
Didn't either Isaiah or Jeremiah only truly convert one person?
I don't know if they converted one person. I mean, Isaiah had some disciples, but right, God told Jeremiah, who he has a disciple and a friend, but Jeremiah was told, you're going to go preach and no one's going to listen. But then God says, but I'm sending you to say that the people were warned. And Jeremiah is saying, even now God's telling you to repent and they're not going to do it. And so it's a very frustrating book. It's a very sad book, Jeremiah. So yeah, so sometimes God can take our work and make it not mean anything. Or like Jeremiah, writing books in the Bible where he writes about the coming of the new covenant, right? So it talks about in Psalm 127 that it's vain to rise early and retire late, because unless the Lord builds a house, it won't stand. Meaning, we think we're doing all this stuff, putting in all this work. God can make our labor mean nothing. Okay, so he says he's acted in this way so that we would fear him. We'd say, okay, God, you're ultimately in charge. Only what you do lasts. And so I'm going to try to orient myself to work, to enjoy life, to do the things that are relevant for me, but to try to trust you to let things last. Okay, so Ecclesiastes goes on in verses 16 and 17. Can somebody read Ecclesiastes 3, 16 and 17? Yeah, Vivian.
Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness even there was wickedness. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work.
Okay, thank you. So he says, look, you look at this world, and you see in the place of righteousness and in the place where justice is supposed to be done, wickedness, sin, evil, corruption. And he says, yet I realized in my heart that since God is in charge of time, he will also have a time for his judgment, and he will judge both the righteous and the wicked alike. Right? So that both of us have to face the judgment of God. So since God is in charge of time, he is also a time appointed for judgment. Right? So that is scary in a sense, but it's also something that we can look forward to in a sense, that God will do right. But we want to be right with God as he does that. Right? So that God is coming in judgment. It should sober us. It should remind us that it's like, okay, I'm worried about all these little things, and then ultimately God is coming to judge. Right? So Ecclesiastes 3:19 talks about we're kind of like the animals in a sense. They live, we live, and they die and we die. But the difference is animals aren't going to be held accountable in God's judgment. Right? So, okay, let's talk about Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Talk about labor. It talks about more things than this, but laboring alone. Okay. You can get a lot done with people, but people are a pain. You guys know, if you've been part of a group project, maybe you are the pain in the group project, I don't know, but you guys have known in a group project why group projects are somewhat effective. I don't really care for them, but lots of people do them. Group projects are somewhat effective because the idea is you can work more effectively together than by yourself. Group projects are also a pain because you have to work with people and people can let you down. And so Ecclesiastes has already pointed out, look, if you are laboring all your life, you build up something really great and an inheritance and a legacy, you hand it off after you die to somebody else, or even while you're still living potentially, and you lose all what? Once you die, you cease to have what over your resources? Control. Yeah, you have no control. So somebody might kind of say, you know what then? I'll work for myself. Yeah, go ahead. I will work on my own. I will not have a dependent. I won't leave an inheritance to anyone. I will just kind of work and take care of things myself. Well, listen to Ecclesiastes 4:8. Well, can somebody read Ecclesiastes 4:8? Yeah, Patrick.
One person who has no other, either son or brother, yet there is no end to all his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This also is vanity and an unhappy business.
Okay, so what happens if you say, basically, I'm going to work on my own, I'm not going to have anybody depend on me, I'm going to avoid kind of working with people, and I'm not going to pass on an inheritance to anybody else? What's the problem there that Ecclesiastes points out here? It says he's not satisfied with riches, but he also doesn't realize what? 4:8.
There's no end.
Yeah, why am I working so hard if I'm not going to do if I'm not going to pass it off to anybody? Why am I limiting myself, limiting my pleasure? Why am I working so hard ultimately for nothing? Right? So even if you give off an inheritance, you can't control it. Even if you don't give off an inheritance, you've worked really hard to ultimately, okay, what was the point of all that? That's what he's pointing at here. So labor alone. Then he talks about, you've got to work with people. Two are better than one in this sense. That a rope that has 3 strands in it is stronger, right, than one. Okay, but working with people is going to let you down. Working not with people is going to let you down. So you and I are this is one of those aspects of human life and existence where we're kind of stuck. Right? We can do some amazing things when we work together, but we can also experience some amazing disappointment when we work with other people. Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. Okay, let's look at Ecclesiastes 5 and the attitude toward God and worship. true worship versus false worship here. Okay, so Ecclesiastes 5 gets into, it's not that people, when they live without God, don't try to seek what they call God in some way, or that they don't know about even the true God, but they seek Him when it's convenient for them, or they seek Him in a way that is dishonoring to Him or foolish. They ask God for what they want. You know, this is kind of like there's this Babylon Bee article that talks about, you know, there's this Christian sitting in a bar, and this guy who doesn't have any relationship with God comes up and says, "Oh yeah, man, don't worry, God won't give you anything more than you can handle." It's that type of thing. People talk about God all the time. But their idea of God is in their minds. It's not usually tied to what and who God is as He's revealed Himself in the Scriptures, and He's told us to approach Him. So some people will worship today, some people will pray today that will be worse off because they prayed. Now God is gracious, He is welcoming, He is merciful, He does save, but there are people who say, I'm going to approach God my way, and God doesn't accept my way in approaching Him, He accepts His way. Right? So that's saved in Christ. That's worshiping in spirit and truth, like Jesus talks about in John 4:24. But listen to, let's hear Ecclesiastes 5:1. Can somebody read that? Ecclesiastes 5:1. Yeah, Patrick.
Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. To draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they are doing evil. Right.
So there is a sense in which Hebrews and Ephesians talks about, because of the work of Christ, we have a boldness to approach God. That God is our Father. He's saved us. He sent Christ to die. You know, because Jesus is there, we're welcome before God. That being said, it says there's a wrong way to approach God. And I've seen this recently, in fact. I'll give you guys a few examples. It says, guard your steps as you go to the house of God, and draw near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they're doing evil. All right, so we're supposed to guard our approach to God in the sense that we don't just approach God as if He's not God. We don't approach God flippantly. We don't approach God and say, okay, well, God, I just want to use you to do the things that I want. Right? That makes God subservient to us. Rather than realizing we approach God on His terms, right? That He's holy, right? That we are supposed to approach Him in a way that honors Him and who He is. Yes, welcome, saved, comforted in Christ, loving Him, and knowing that He welcomes that, but also knowing that He's holy. Right? So, I remember seeing a video. You can, look up on YouTube videos of foolish worship. It goes on all over the place. And I remember a video from a few years ago where people were, the worship leader, which is really a false worship leader in my opinion, told the people they were going to sing a song, and they took a secular song, threw Jesus in there, and the guy said, I want everybody to take one of your socks off and spin them around like this, and jump up and down and dance. And then they sing, the song, You Spin Me Right Round, that song. They said, you spin me right round, Jesus, right round. And they're jumping. That's not pleasing to God. Well, how do you know? Because it's not according to His Word. It's not... people do... there's an epidemic, especially in the West, in America, because we're very free, and we have so many options as to worship, and we don't get, people can kind of put together different views of what they want, which, some of that's good. That freedom is, I'd rather have that than, a state governmental persecution for false religions. But that being said, this brings about a lot of what I call my Godism. Do you guys get what I'm saying there? What is my Godism? Because you guys have heard this, I'm sure. Hudson? Yeah.
It's kind of like we believe in your own kind of God.
Yeah, you kind of have we're very personal. We have we craft our own kind of God, kind of like, you go to Build-A-Bear or something, and you're like, you build a God in your own mind. Yeah, Sophia, what do you think? My Godism.
It's like
you change what you don't like and you conform it to your life, not to his life.
Yes, it's making a God in our own image and then worshiping what we've made. Yeah, exactly. If something is true of God that I don't like, God must change. That, which makes him not God, by the way. But you've heard this before. My God would never do this or that. My God is a God of love. My God is not mean like your God. My God would never judge sin or send anybody to hell, right? Or that people say, after they're acting usually in a sinful way, they'll say, only God can judge me. And it's like, that is the problem. Yeah, only God can judge you should be something that should sober us, not say, okay, well, I'm going to be bolder in my sin, right? So, my Godism. But when people say my God would never do this or that, I say, well, yeah, of course not, because your God doesn't exist. You've already admitted that your God is an imaginary idea in your mind that now you are unfairly trying to hold people to, which is what they accuse the Christians of. But the only words and works, or they'll call it Jesus. I believe in Jesus, but not the Bible. That's what a lot of people will say. But it's like, but the only words and works you have of Jesus is the Bible, right? And it gets dangerous when people call whatever their belief is Jesus, because there are a lot of false Jesuses out there. There are false views of Christ that cause you not to believe in the true Christ and be saved. There are false views of the gospel. So there are people who worship all over the world who are worshiping God in a way that does not please him. So there's a futility in worship as well. That not all worship is good. Not all worship is created equal. Not all worship is God honoring. And one of the things I think is one of the most dangerous trends that we even have to be careful of in our churches, because I've heard people who are Bible-believing Christians say these types of things. Where they'll say, well, I think Jesus would, and then I want to be like, stop right there. I think God would, unless they have chapter and verse, in my opinion, I don't want to hear it. Because what that person is doing is they are projecting onto God something that he never said, right? Or something that he has not revealed about himself. So people say things that even are kind of harmless in a sense, where they say, well, I believe Jesus probably danced. It's like, where are you getting that from? I'm not saying it's not true. Maybe he did. He went to weddings. He did, who knows? But I can't say that definitively. And then what are we supposed to conclude because you think Jesus danced? What are we supposed to conclude from that thing that you imagined that Jesus might have done? Right? I argue a lot about, that the Bible is the only foundation for the authority of the words and works of Jesus, that you can't verify anything that's tradition, right? Like the Roman Catholics say, well, we have apostolic and tradition that goes back to Jesus and the apostles that's outside of the Scripture. And I say, but anybody could say that. I could make the argument that Jesus' favorite color is purple. It might have been. I don't know, but I could just say it's an ancient tradition that Jesus' favorite color is purple, but there's no way to verify whether what I've said is true or false. And so people do that all the time. When they did the golden calf, God didn't say, well, it must be good worship because they're having a good time or they meant well. They approached God in a way that wasn't honoring to him. When Nadab and Abihu offer strange fire in Leviticus 10, God doesn't say, well, they were trying. I see that their hearts were good. No, God says, I will be treated by those who draw near to me as holy. And so he says here, guard your steps. Listen to verse Ecclesiastes 5:2. Do not be hasty in word or impulsive in thought to bring up a matter in the presence of God. For God is in heaven and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few. Meaning we can pray to God openly, but he says, look, bring things to God in a way that's not hasty, that doesn't forget who God is. In 5:3, for a dream comes through much effort, but the voice of a fool comes through many words. Right? When people talk a lot, that's where we tend to get ourselves in trouble. And then he says here again, he repeats another theme, Ecclesiastes 5:7. For in many dreams and in many words there is emptiness, rather fear God. Okay, so he says, look, people want to have their visions, they want to have their dreams, they want to say, God told me. They want to talk a lot about God, what they think about God. They want to speculate about God endlessly. But he says, instead what we need to do is fear God. And then at the end of the book, he'll say, fear God and keep his commandments, meaning we know God according to his word. We don't say, I have a feeling and God has said this, and I kind of put them both together. We say, despite what I think or feel about things, this is what God has said, because our feelings can lead us astray. Okay, let's look at further in chapter 5, riches, money, and wealth. Okay, can somebody read Ecclesiastes 5:10? Yeah, Vivian.
He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This is also vanity.
Okay, so money can be a really effective tool. It's something that develops within advanced economies that helps us be more precise than with barter. Because if you're trying to barter, you're just trading goods for goods without money, you have a problem that you usually run into. And the problem is this. If you have a chicken and you're trying to trade your chicken for a chair, okay, that a guy has made, what if the guy doesn't want a chicken? What if he wants oranges? Well, then you have to trade your chicken for orange. Money streamlines all that. It allows you to be more precise. So money does come with certain, abilities, certain resources, power to do things, right? And money can be used very effectively. Proverbs talks a lot about how we use our money. But here it talks about the idea of money having a hold over us, that if you love money, you won't be satisfied with it. No matter how much money you make, nor he who loves abundance with its income. This is vanity. Yeah. Yeah. And then it reminds us, look, you may make a lot of money and have control over a lot of resources, but you and I, we came into the world with $0, we're leaving the world with $0. Okay? Ecclesiastes 5:15 says, as he had come naked from his mother's womb, so he will return as he came. He will take nothing from the fruit of his labor that he can carry in his hand. Yeah?
Abby and Sophia and I have to go.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Okay. All right, can somebody read Ecclesiastes 5:16? 5:16. Yeah, Eli.
This also is a grievous evil. Just as he came, so shall he go. What gain is there to him who toils for the wind?
Right. So, exactly as somebody comes into the world, they leave. No matter how much you rearrange resources, how much you die with, you're still dead. You still leave the world empty in that sense, empty-handed. Okay. There was this old Jewish parable of the fox that he has to fast 3 days, not eat, so he can squeeze through this wall and get into this vineyard and go, and he eats a bunch of food. Then he realizes he can't get out through the same hole, so he has to wait, fast for 3 days to get back through the hole. Right? So he basically came in with nothing, left with the same amount. Right? And then he says, look, what advantage is it? If you work really hard, you accomplish a lot, you're just at this point, then it's all pointless, for you and I, purposeless to work for that. So what are we meant to take away from this? Well, listen to Ecclesiastes 5:18 and following. He says, here is what I have seen to be good and fitting, to eat, to drink, and to enjoy oneself in all of one's labor and toils under the sun for the few years that God has given him, for this is his reward. Furthermore, as for every man whom God has given riches and wealth, he has also empowered him to eat from them and receive reward and rejoice in his labor. It is a gift from God. For he will not often consider the years of his life, because God keeps him occupied with the gladness of heart. Okay, so it says, look, you're supposed to enjoy it, but you can only enjoy it when you're right with God, you fear Him, you have eternity set, you recognize the coming of God's judgment, and you say, okay, well then God gives me this time to work, to occupy myself, to have purpose, to enjoy life, to enjoy the resources I've gathered while I'm living. And you don't think too much about life, and life being short or feeling long or whatever the case is, because God occupies you with gladness of heart. My dad, before he became a Christian, he was a nice guy, but he was obsessed with money. He was obsessed, he wanted to become a millionaire by 25 years old. And so that was his goal. He was all about starting businesses, all about making money. And then he got saved while he was in college, and that kind of faded into the background. But he was still a businessman. He was still successful, but money no longer had that hold over him. And so God gave him a great career, gave him good resources. He retired last year. He's living well. He's happy. He's doing ministry. He's doing the things that he wants. But the money doesn't have that hold over him. But somebody who's obsessed with money, they're going to work their whole lives to make a bunch of money, and then they're going to die, right? And if you don't know God, then there's no point to all of that. Okay. Okay, let's talk about Ecclesiastes 7 real quick. We've got about 10 minutes here, so I want us to finish up with this. Let's talk about wisdom, folly, and death. How death grounds and orients us in knowing what's actually important. Can somebody read Ecclesiastes 7:1? Yeah, Eli.
A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. Okay. So it says the second part makes more sense to us, that the day of one's death is better than one's birth. But it says the first part, why does it hang these two things together? A good name is better than a good ointment. Okay, so a good name is about reputation, okay, and people remembering you and kind of looking back on your life and what you have contributed. But what's a good ointment have to do with it? Let me put it this way. Ointment was kind of what they used as like deodorant. And you put on deodorant, why? What is deodorant to cover up? Bad smell, right? So he says here, a good name, a truly good name, is better than a good what? Cover up. Very good, yeah. And so he says, in the day of one's death can be better than one's birth. Okay. Ecclesiastes 7:2. It talks about here that that death causes us to think about what actually matters in life. Okay, listen to Ecclesiastes 7:2. My dad and I, at separate times, have used this verse when we're speaking at a memorial for somebody who has died, whether they're a believer or not, to say, look, we need to direct our focus back to the reality of death and the need for the gospel, need to be right with God, because we all face death, and this is a reminder of that right now, and it allows us a time to focus on that while we're still alive. Listen to Ecclesiastes 7:2. It is better to go to a house of mourning than a house of feasting, because that is the end of every man, and the living takes it to heart. So he says it's better to be at a memorial service, at a funeral, than to be just continually enjoying yourselves, because that's when God gives us the opportunity to recognize death is the end of every person. We don't know when. That timing is in God's control as well. But we all face the reality of death. And I even used this at my grandfather's memorial. I read selections from the book of Ecclesiastes to try to talk to my unbelieving family about the need to be right with God before death. Right? Death grounds us and orients us where we have times in our life where we're happy, where nothing, things aren't going wrong, and then all of a sudden something comes up, somebody dies, not necessarily close to us, but that causes us to realize, wait a second, we all are going to die. That's the end of every man, and we need to take that to heart. It says in verse 3, sorrow is better than laughter, for when the face is happy,
when the face is sad, the heart may be happy, right? Meaning when you're sad about somebody who's died, it causes your heart to think through the reality of death. Verse 4, the mind of the wise is in the house of mourning, while the mind of fools is in the house of pleasure. No matter how much pleasure you have in life, you're going to die. So the wise person can enjoy life because they've already squared with the reality of death. They've already squared with fearing God, eternity, and God's judgment. Therefore, you can actually enjoy life without it being pointless. But the person who is just in the house of pleasure, doesn't think about death, all of that pleasure just goes away. Right? So this is a message a lot of people, younger people especially, need to hear. Is you think you're living for pleasure, but it's going to not matter at death. Okay, just to finish up this book here and kind of tie off these things. There's a lot of verses I would like us to get to in Ecclesiastes 8. It talks about because God doesn't execute His judgment against sin right away, that causes people to think He never will. But he says, but that's not true. That God is going to judge sin. Then in Ecclesiastes 11, it tells us to remember God, to rejoice in God, to remember our Creator in the days of our youth. Right? So remember God and serve Him while you're young. Don't put it off and say, I'm going to serve God later. You don't know that. Number one, because you and I don't know how long we'll live. But also, if I say I'm not going to serve, I'm going to just have fun now, not serve God, not follow God, not submit to Christ, not believe in Him until I'm 50, I don't know that my heart will be ready to believe in God when I'm 50. My heart may get so hard that I won't turn to God in the future, right? So if you're convicted to turn to Christ now, you got to do it now, because otherwise it can that feeling can go away and you may not be convicted like that again. Okay, so where does the book end us? Okay, the book leaves us off where Solomon ends where he began, where he says, look, I started out asking God for a listening heart to discern good and evil. I needed wisdom, and I identified that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, at the beginning of Proverbs. Now he said, after all that, in my sin, I explored all these areas, and I realized life is pointless. Life is futile. Life is vain. It's mysterious. It's chasing after the wind. What I came back to in realizing these things that orient me, the fear of God, the reality of death, eternity and God's judgment, I realized that I'm ending where I began. Okay? Conclusion is he says he ends at the beginning. He had it right, but he walked away from it. Okay? And what does, this is in Ecclesiastes, this is in Ecclesiastes 12, 13 through 14, okay, which tells us, can somebody read that? Ecclesiastes 12, 13, and 14. Vivian.
The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear of God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Okay,
so the conclusion is what? There's two things in verse 13.
Fear God and keep His commandments.
Yes. Okay, so he says, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Fear God. How do we know we're fearing God? How do we know we're living rightly to Him? Because we have His Word. Keep His commandments. And then in verse 14 he says, because this applies to every person, and that God will hold accountable. That there is judgment that orients everything. Okay, so God's judgment and accountability. God will bring every hidden thing to judgment. Right? We're either saved and safe in Christ, or we're facing God's judgment on our own for our sins, and God remembers everything. Right? So this is what grounds somebody in true wisdom, is the knowledge of these things. So you and I don't have to go through all the sin. that Solomon experienced, because he says all of this was pointless, came back to fear God, keep his commandments. God's going to judge the world, so I need to be ready. Okay, so we will end that